People die, people cry, people try to survive on this planet full. Oh Lord, my people die, people cry, people try to survive on this planet full of mysteries. My people die, people cry, people try to survive on this planet full.
Well, thank you so much. I think we'll get started here. So welcome everyone to the Sanctuary for Independent Media's End of Life in the Age of COVID event series, presented by the People's Health Sanctuary. My name is Xavier, and I'm one of the coordinators for the People's Health Sanctuary. The focus of tonight's event is feeling stretched thin and how grief and trauma are laying on our relationships right now. We're so grateful to be able to spend this evening with you, our community. To start, we're going to be recording the event and streaming on Facebook Live. If you would not like your picture to be shown, this is a good time to turn off your video, although we hope to keep seeing everyone's faces during the presentation. When talking about grief, we can start with the ground we walk on, the history beneath our feet. The sanctuary sits on land formerly home to the Mohican people, who are indigenous peoples of the lands of New York. With gratitude and humility, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge their struggle against colonization. And then I think taking a next step and working to understand what acknowledging that grief asks of us. For those of you not yet familiar with the sanctuary, we operate a block-wide campus of activities. The Sanctuary for Independent Media, our headquarters, doubles as a telecommunications facility and performance venue where we host speakers, independent film screenings, and live music. It's also home to 2 recording studios for our community radio station, WOOC 105.3 FM, on which we air a volunteer-driven nightly news show called the Hudson Mohawk Magazine. We also run a variety of youth programs, operate College City Growers, our urban gardens, and bring all of our activities out into Freedom Square, our outdoors performance venue. This spring, we're excited to be opening the doors to the newest building on the block, the Nature Lab Urban Environmental Education Center, which will house a community science lab. It will also be a permanent home for the People's Health Sanctuary, and we plan to offer more programming in the spirit of tonight's event. For those of you who this is your first event with the People's Health Sanctuary, it's a project supported by the Nature Lab and Sanctuary for Independent Media. Our mission is to embrace models of open sharing of health and knowledge and empower all of the growing collective of community members to seek their independent health goals, as opposed to the traditional hierarchical top-down approach of clinical medical practice. Through caring for our elders, our children, or cooking soul-nourishing food for family or friends, which may not be deemed as real healthcare, they know that in fact, it's what holds us together and keeps us sane and healthy. Our growing network sharing skills to build a space where creative, joyful health is possible and accessible. And we're working towards building a space in the new Nature Lab building to center community health and health justice in North Central Troy. We also are in the midst of beginning a big fundraising campaign, which will help us towards that goal, which we'll talk about at the end. Now, I just want to introduce the series here, End of Life in the Age of COVID. This is the second part of a 3-part series, the first one being in December. And in the midst of unprecedented personal, national, and global oppression, suffering, and death, how do we process loss to maintain hopeful connections? End of Life in the Age of COVID features conversations about our experiences of death, end of life care, and also the creation of social and spiritual community during the pandemic. How do we honor the memory and voices of the dying? How can our grief inform and inspire us to create a new world that is inclusive and responsive to the needs of marginalized populations most hard hit by COVID? We're so honored today to be hosting Urban Grief and Lisa Good, who I just want to take a minute to introduce her. Urban Grief is a trauma-informed and healing-centered 501c3 community-based organization. Urban Grief responds to the traumatic impact of community violence, death, and loss through community education, crisis response, victim advocacy, and grief support. Urban Grief provides relevant and relatable information about trauma, grief, self-care, resiliency, and victim services. Urban Grief acknowledges the prevalence of adverse childhood experiences, along with chronic exposure to traumatic events, and strives to avoid further re-traumatization. And Lisa Good, the presenter today, holds a master in social work, is the founding director of Urban Grief, a trauma-informed community-based organization. She's the former director of SNUG, which used to be known as Cure Violence, and has over 25 years of human service experience. She's an experienced speaker and trainer, facilitating trauma-informed workshops such as adverse childhood experiences and community events, faith-based workshops aimed at creating healing spaces and empowering community members through information about trauma, grief, and resilience. And with that, it's my honor to introduce Lisa and to walk us through feeling stretched thin tonight.
Hello. Thank you. I'm so glad to be with you tonight. And I want to talk about this topic of trauma and grief under the umbrella of being stretched. And just to give you a little bit of a hint of where that word came from, it's because throughout the pandemic and the shutdown and then being quarantined and, and personally, dealing with COVID, losing people to COVID in conjunction with the summer that we had. But for me, from the community work in terms of responding to violence, that long before we got to the summer, that there were already numerous acts of violence occurring every single week. And so, going into the shutdown and the pandemic with all of those, those concerns about the violence that I saw increasing, and kind of getting a glimpse of what the summer was going to be like. But there was nothing in my prior experience, doing the work around, trying to support individuals and community members. But having this experience of, going into the shutdown and having a glimpse of what the summer could potentially hold, but never, ever in a million years thinking that, within the capital region that we would experience the type of losses that we did due to violence. But not only were we experiencing these local losses due to violence, but we were also having this collective sense of loss due to the people who were being harmed and killed by racialized violence. And so for me, when I was trying to process and make sense of the losses that I was experiencing, due to COVID, when I was trying to make sense of the losses, and process what was happening nationally around the racial violence, whether it was from white supremacists or from state-sanctioned violence in the form of, police brutality, what came to me, there would be days, and I'm being totally transparent, there would be days when I would just feel so sad and overwhelmed and just full of grief, right? Crying for my own losses, crying for my community, crying for my people, just really burdened, like in my body, in my mind, in my spirit, with just this weighty sense of grief. And it appeared that as soon as I got my footing and said, okay, I've cried, or I've made space, I've created capacity, I walked, I exercised, I did deep breathing, I ate well, I slept well, I did all these things, right? That they say, we tell people to do when they're trying to take care of themselves and manage their loss process. I did all of those things. However, as we move through the months, the losses continue to accumulate. And so one day I was just kind of sitting at my desk and I was kind of thinking, oh, I can call so-and-so and talk to them about how I'm feeling. And I'm like, no, wait, they lost 3 people. Oh, I could call so-and-so and talk to them about the stress that this whole experience of what it was like to, deal with COVID in my house. Like, I could talk to so-and-so. I'm like, wait a second, no, I can't. They're like really sick, 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 And so what I found myself doing is kind of going through my list of my support networks, my go-to resources, and pausing and thinking, we're stretched. Like literally our social networks are stretched. And so what I want to do is just kind of give some basic definitions. And I didn't want this to be like so much as a scholarly kind of presentation, but I wanted to, put some basic definitions out that I find useful and meaningful, that help me when I'm, working with families to educate them about their own grief journey. And then I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about social support and some of the ways that our social support has been taxed in this season, and what are the implications for our long-term wellness and survival through what seems to be a period in our history that's going to be ongoing and enduring, particularly when we think about the continuation of deaths. Someone said, "I don't know how you do it." I replied, "I don't have a choice." That's not a statement that came from me, but it's a quote. But it is a quote that I am hearing over and over and over again from people in the community, where we are literally saying to each other, "I don't know how you're doing it." And the reply is, "I don't really feel as if I have a choice." And what is the it that people are referring to? The it that they're referring to is, how are you surviving in the face of continued and ongoing losses? How are you managing it? And so the it that people are referencing is the continued navigation of adversity, the continued navigation of trauma, the continued navigation of losses, one after another. So one of the things that, I first want to highlight as it relates to grief is that there are, two people can be experiencing the same loss, but grief is not the same for everyone. It's based on your relationship with who and what was lost. This means that different people will respond differently. And the reason I point that out is because when I talk about your social support systems and the people that you rely on to support you during hard times being stretched, sometimes the stretching occurs within our relationships and our social circles, because people have an expectation that even though they may have experienced similar loss or similar losses right now in this current context that you have also experienced, there may be an expectation within your support networks that you have a similar response. But what happens if your response does not look like, the response of other people around you? Right. And so at a time where you most need support, you may find yourself not getting the support that you need simply because people don't understand that when it comes to grief and when it comes to trauma, that two different people may have different responses, even to the same event or to the same loss. So grief is not the same for everyone. It's really based on your relationship with who and what was lost. So if we contextualize this in terms of, racial trauma and the grief that Black and Brown people experience in response to national incidents that result in harm and death, the grief that I may express may be completely different from another group, simply because of the relationship between who and what was lost, right? And so we have to acknowledge that within our support structures, or within our relationships, that sometimes the relationship is stretched in terms of tension and conflict, simply because we don't recognize, or we're not always sensitive to how different people may have different responses to the same types of losses. So the next thing that I want to give you, and this is a definition that I use often when I talk about trauma. It may not be the definition that other people use in their practice, but when I'm talking to everyday people about trauma, this is a combination of a definition that I use. And it's this: that the word trauma is used to describe experiences or situations that are outside of the normal experiences of everyday life, that can cause a lot of stress, emotional pain, and distress. These events or experiences can sometimes involve horror, helplessness, serious injury, threat or serious injury, or death, and can be dehumanizing, shocking, or terrifying. It can be singular or multiple compounding events over time, and include a betrayal of trust by a trusted person, institution, and it can also include a loss of safety. These traumatic events can overwhelm a person's ability to cope, leaving them powerless. And so I want to highlight the word helplessness. I want to highlight the word death. I want to highlight the word dehumanizing. I want to highlight the word terrifying. I want to highlight the word multiple and compounding and over time and loss of safety. So when we think about COVID, and when we think about, the violence, and when we intersect that with the racial trauma that has taken place locally and nationally, the most of the conversation that people bring to me is this issue or this experience of helplessness, right? That they want to do something, and they themselves are feeling robbed of their power or their agency to be able to take care of themselves, but not only take care of themselves, but also to protect others. And so, in the context of grief and trauma, for me, this helplessness that gets presented to me, whether it's in individual conversations or in conversations that I may have with groups of individuals, this helplessness and this loss of agency and the ability to be able to protect yourself from the events, produces a sense of loss that requires mourning and grief. So there's an emotional response, but then there's also this outward expression of mourning. But when there is no acknowledgement of the harm that is caused through the traumatic events, not only do I miss the opportunity to to find my agency or my power or my footing, so to speak, but I also, my right to grieve and express or mourn that loss is also denied and taken away, right? And so, when I think about this helplessness, and the experiences that we've had with one loss after another has a community, helplessness and lack of agency comes to mind. One, because it blocks our ability to actually be able to have space and have social circles that allow us to have space to acknowledge that I feel helpless, to acknowledge that I am uncertain about how to protect myself or protect other people that I love, particularly, when you're in a body that looks like mine. And so that piece in and of itself is traumatic, but it also produces grief. Um, and it produces a sense of loss that may tax or stretch our social circles because, not everybody may be processing it in that way. And so for me, the question becomes, where do I go and who do I go to find that support and the comfort and the validation and the affirmation that I need in those moments of pain? Right. The other aspect of the trauma definition that I'm using, ties right into this, which is dehumanizing. That when your personhood is not valued, and you're not viewed as human, therefore the empathy that ought to be directed your way in response to the grief that you have from traumatic losses or experiences of trauma, um, it's not directed your way. So what that means is that instead of your social support expanding, because now there's large groups of people that understand that you have gone through individually and collectively this horrific experience, instead of your empathy network or your support network expanding, actually, I have found that because you have been dehumanized, your network of social support actually can constrict, right? It can become even more narrow, and the few people that you may have may then in turn be carrying more of the burden around being in relationship with you because they are bearing witness firsthand to your loss, to your helplessness. And so what happens, going back to that quote that I started out with, which is, I don't know how you do it, right? But you just find a way and you keep doing it. Going back to that quote, within that constricted or that narrow group of people that you can trust, who are willing to figure out a way to keep making capacity, that's one of those end results of the dehumanizing of one group of people's pain versus humanizing and creating empathy for another group of people's pain. And so in one aspect, one group of people, one group of people's um, social circle becomes constricted, while the other group of people's social support becomes expanded. Not because the people in those social networks, both near and far, have any more capacity than the other, based on the pandemic, based on the violence, based on the economic losses, based on the deaths. It all comes down to willingness and availability, right? And so, this narrowing of social support, we see that in a lot of areas. For me, the end result and what I see happening for people is that they shut down, because now, where can I go? And who can I go to? Because sometimes the people that you think may be empathetic or concerned, or the people that you may think have capacity, actually don't. Right? The other aspect of this definition of trauma that I'm using is this notion of singular or multiple compounding events over time. So from my position, looking, apart from the pandemic, when I look at the multiple or compounding events over time for Black and Brown people relevant to our grief, and being stretched, is that these racialized incidents of violence and trauma that result in death and no justice, so to speak, or no acknowledgement that damage has been done and harm has been caused, and that there is trauma and grief, relevant to that. It actually kind of creates this thing where we come into the pandemic with multiple compounding events that have taken place over time. And I'm talking about losses, traumatic types of losses that are experienced individually and collectively. So when you fast forward into the pandemic and the compounding losses that certain groups of people are experiencing because of health inequities and health disparities, right? In conjunction with the compounded losses and events that people have already been experiencing over time, and now you enter into a pandemic and into a stretch of violence that has been unprecedented, right? You see why, this definition of trauma, for me, really resonates in conjunction with loss. And so for me, I can't talk about one without talking about the other. The last part of this definition that I want to highlight is the loss of safety. That in order to grieve, you have to have social networks that are safe. And in order to grieve and be supported, if your social networks have been stretched repeatedly from all of these compounding events over time, but now they're being stretched even more because of current events, you really get to a place of, where the capacity in comparison to the number of losses and the lack of time to adequately process those losses in between time is actually almost none. And so when I think about the loss of safety, what happens is that, okay, my social support is stretched. They are tired of hearing about the racialized trauma or grief that I'm experiencing. They may be tired of talking about the death related to violence. They may be tired of hearing my grief after, homicide. They may be tired, or they have their own losses as well. And so really there is a limited capacity for people to actually be able to support the people that they love and value. So I'm going to pause right there because I see things are in the chat. I just want to take a quick look in the chat. Okay, I see the note about I miss everyone. Yes. So I want to continue. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so going back to, I just kind of gave you this definition of trauma that I use, but I highlighted some particular words and tried to tie them to grief, right? And so, grief is the normal and natural emotional reaction to loss or change of any kind. It's those conflicting feelings caused by the end of or change in a familiar pattern of behavior. It's the experience of reaching out for someone who's always been there and they are no longer there. So when we think about, when we frame it around these compounding losses that we already enter into the pandemic with because of racism, because of health inequity, because of violence, right? Which creates disproportionate death rates among Black and Brown and Indigenous people, okay? And then we enter in to the pandemic, and now because of social distancing and CDC guidelines around gathering, being with your family, being with your friends, doing the social things that would normally bring us comfort, not only are we having this experience of missing the people that we love, but we're also having this experience of missing our sense of safety just to be able to go out and be about. Okay. We're also having the missing the ability, in a very limited way, that the little bit of safety that we may have previously felt prior to this spring about being, in a Black and Brown body, that's gone. And so consequently, when I think about grief in this context, and it's overlaid with trauma and those traumatic experiences that I described to you earlier, we're not just reaching out for someone who's always been there and they are no longer there. We're reaching out for the person that's gone. We're reaching out for the life that we once knew, okay? And we're reaching for a social support network that we may no longer have access to. And so consequently, I am grieving not only the people that I lost, but I'm also grieving the people and the ways that I would normally be able to access them, connect with them, touch them, mourn with them. Okay, I'm missing that piece too. So when you think about the reaching, when we think about the reaching, we're reaching on multiple levels. It's not just this one plane. So grief, just as an aside, when you are experiencing grief, there are going to be changes, right? There's going to be an emotional response, right? Which, runs the gamut of those emotions, from sadness to guilt to anxiety to fear to, to shame, the emotions, anger, the emotions are going to run the gamut. So there's the emotional or affective response to loss, but then there's also, the cognitive response, to loss, right? Those thoughts, a thought that I hear often, especially from younger people, is every time I care for somebody, they leave or they die. Okay. So there's these cognitive thoughts, right? But then there's also, your brain's stress response, right? And so in that context, we are more comfortable with the emotion part of it. We look for and expect the emotional reactions to grief, but we don't always give credence to some of those cognitive distortions that may come out of grief, okay? And we don't always give credence to the stress response related to grief, right? And so, that may include difficulty remembering, difficulty focusing, difficulty keeping track of details, It may include a lot of repetitive thoughts about why, how could this happen, thoughts about the preventability of the death, thoughts about the detail of the death, particularly when you're talking about violence, the, persistent thoughts around retaliation, right? So, sometimes we don't always give credence to that. And if we do, we may not necessarily, we may isolate it from the experience of grief, and we may isolate it from the experience of that loss as having traumatic elements. The traumatic elements around COVID and violence and racial violence are the sudden nature of it, the sudden and uncontrollable elements of it. Okay, you can't really plan for it, so you can't anticipate it. You don't know when it's coming or where it's coming. Okay, with COVID, not being able to access your family members and support them in a way that you have been accustomed to supporting them. So, there are a lot of pieces. So when we think about the traumatic grief, it really combines, let me back up to grief, the grief part. So I covered the emotional part, I covered the cognitive and the stress response part, but let me just, I also want to talk about the physical or the body's response to grief, which is another piece that we don't necessarily give credence to. And so, the somatic experiences of grief and trauma can be very similar. Gastrointestinal upset, okay, body aches, headaches, suppressed immune system, which makes you more vulnerable to other forms of illness like colds and viruses. And if your immune system is already compromised, maybe from some sort of chronic illness, and then now you're having this compounded losses, and they are all traumatic in nature, right? It means that physically your body is under a lot of stress. And so a lot of times when people are not able to verbalize or give expression, or they don't have the social networks that have the capacity to hold the words that need to be spoken, okay, to hold the words that need to be spoken, the body will begin to speak. And so, constipation, diarrhea, all of those kinds of things. You could have a chronic health condition that was previously managed with medication, and now all of a sudden, you could be having these experiences physically where it's not managed at all, right? Or the medicines are no longer working. So when we think about our social supports and how they are stretched, right? Can you imagine that if you are a person who's not really verbal with your words, in terms of how you express your grief, and maybe, you don't cry, or, that's not something that you do as an expression of mourning, right? And you don't have you don't have the words, your body begins to, respond to the stress, right? That physical aspect of it. And now I want you just to take that and picture your body responding, you're grieving. We are all having these compounded losses. However, your social support is seeing you not feeling well. They're seeing that your medicine is not working, or they're seeing you get sick. And I want you to think about what that means for them in terms of being their responsibility or their commitment to support you. And they may not always understand that your illness may be an expression of your pain. Okay. And the testing and the stress or the strain that puts on that social connection, or the access, your ability to access the support. Because when people are having a lot of body stuff, but and they know that they've had losses, they're aware of the losses, but when I talk to them, they may, the people around them may not see that the lack of the other pieces being present is not an indicator that that person is not grieving. It just means that the grief is being displayed differently. And so if I'm in your social support and I don't recognize that, then I'm not able to maybe use that as a point or an opportunity to start a conversation with you about how you're responding to grief, not in judgment, but just as a way to let you know that I see that your losses are having an impact on you and I am here. Okay. And so it's in that capacity that I also have, I see a lot of people and their supports are being stretched. Okay. So I just want to so cumulative grief, in the shortest way that, in least academic way that I want to put it right now, is just this experience of being hit with one loss after another without having time in between. Time in between to process, time in between to adapt, time in between to figure out your coping, okay? All while dealing with these intrusive aspects of trauma symptoms that overlap and overlay some of the grief symptoms. And some of those trauma symptoms that may overlap and overlay some of these grief symptoms might include intrusive memories or dreams, or nightmares. Okay. It might include some avoidance, types of behaviors or experiences, right? It's an overlapping, but again, there's no opportunity to recover because you're being hit with one loss after another. So if we take a personal look at ourselves and our own circles, right? Here's where, for me, the challenge comes, right? Is that if I'm experiencing all these compounded losses, I don't just carry the weight of my own individual personal losses, but anybody who knows me knows that when my community is grieving, I'm grieving too. Like this week has been just almost unbearable, right? But when I think about who I might go to, right, I also consider their capacity. Okay. And what I'm finding is that because of COVID, because of violence, because of the economic losses, because of all of these other things, that the pillars of people's social support circles have been shaken and rocked. And so all of us have a go-to person that we rely on and use. And those people that we have normally gone to and leaned on, now they need people to lean on. And the people that they leaned on need people to lean on. And so what I have seen firsthand and what I've worked to do was to kind of look at those social networks, look at the areas that they are stretched in, look at my own areas and capacity for supporting others and where it's been stretched the most. Where is the band weakest? Where is it strongest? Where can there be repair done? Where can adjustments be made and changes made? But stretched is about acknowledging these overlapping experiences of traumatic events, losses. Some of the losses are producing, traumatic grief responses. Okay, and that in this current climate, our social networks are stretched. The pillars of people's social have been stretched to capacity, and we individually and as a community, we need to start to think about strategically how we are going to enhance our capacity, rethink our capacity, and adapt and build additional capacity within these, our immediate circles, our concentric circles. How are we going to enhance and build capacity so that we can not just survive in this time, but we can thrive and heal, thrive and heal. And so if you are one of those people that other people lean on, I want to empower you and let you know that it's okay to take a step back and reevaluate your capacity, okay? And think about what adjustments you would like to make, all right? And where do you need to maybe shift and not, and it doesn't mean you stop supporting, it just may mean that what you do and how you do it and what you give and how you give it may need to change, because we need to preserve, we need to protect and preserve those who are extending and extending and extended, right? And we need to build out a bigger umbrella where there is diversity of streams of support that people can tap into, understanding that the same way different people have different responses to loss and trauma, that they also have different needs, and that it is not a one size fits all. So I'll stop there because I want to have this conversation about your experiences, your supports, and what does it mean to look at your supports? What are the ways that you can build your support, maybe get rid of it and find something completely different? But also, how do we build capacity within our community when there has been so much trauma, so much loss, and all of these losses are have very traumatic elements involved that require not just, if there's such a word, normal support, but also a more detailed and kind of sensitive and knowledge-based support, so that we can again have a community that's not just surviving, but we're thriving and we're healing and we're transmitting healing and a sense of hope and future to our children and our families. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That was quite amazing. Yeah, I'll kind of leave it up to folks if they have comments and they would like to speak, and if not, there are a few questions that we can ask.
I wanted to say, Lisa, I'm sorry it's so dark here, but I'm here. I'm really touched by what you said, and something that's been helping me is my mom was sick. She got sick with lymphoma right at the beginning of COVID, so I couldn't take her to her chemo appointments. She lives 4 hours away, but I would have been there, for every one of her appointments. So she was really my go-to person. But something that's helped is talking with other elders or other people who are my elders, and not family members, but people who have been around the block and and have been through things. And it's been really steadying. But this time is hard too, because those are our elders are the people who are so vulnerable right now. And it's hard to figure out how to connect safely, and you're worried about them too. So I'm just thinking about how steadying that is to have elders, but also how that's also a piece of this grief that's happening right now.
Yes, when you brought up the elders, I that really resonated with me. Again, one of the ways, that we care for our elders is that, we show up and we try to be present when they need us, right? Particularly for our parents, to be present in a way that is meaningful. And, COVID took that opportunity to be present and support in that way. When you talk about connecting with elders, I know for me, and I'm not sure if this resonates with anyone else, but a big part of the mourning or the sense of loss that I've been experiencing is just the watching of the elders die. Like even celebrities, right? Just watching this, it's like a changing of the guard. And so even though you don't know these people personally, it's almost like a chapter in history is being closed every single time, one of these people die. And that produces a level of grief as well. So when you talk about connecting safely, with your elders, that is such an important strategy for thriving, because, with all of the losses, it also makes you almost hyper vigilant about, well, who else may go, right? And so, and what if they go and I don't get to connect? And so, connecting with them and, and engaging in meaningful conversation with them about living through cumulative losses, right? Because the elders have lived through cumulative losses. Once you get past 65, your social network starts to shrink. Because once you hit 70s and 80s, sometimes your parents are deceased, your siblings are deceased, your partners may be deceased, you've lost friends. Wow, someone put in the chat that they've had a number of losses, right? And so, but here's my experience, being on the ground, particularly in my community, is that I have met young people that have the loss histories of 80-year-old adults. And so, and they don't have access to elders. The elders that they have access to, like we the elders, right? Anybody over 35 is an elder, right? But what's happened is that we've gotten so many distorted messages about grief, and we've been, so there's so much suppression of grief. And when you talk about Black and brown people, there's the criminalization of the expression of their grief, that the people who have had life experiences based on age that ought to be able to give some guidance around, here's how you recover when your mom dies. Here's how you learn to live in a non-destructive way as a response to death. That those folks have suppressed so much because they have had so many compounded losses themselves, that sometimes their capacity in knowledge around helping the next generation navigate this place that we're in now is limited. And that's why, like my team, like literally, I'm just trying to take a sledgehammer to all of that and just like literally break down the barriers so that we can actually have the conversation, so that there is this exchange between elders and young people, so that in the event that our elders do leave and then become our ancestors, that we we can have that treasure of knowledge and wisdom that we can then use to help us thrive through hard times. Any other questions? I see some comments in the box. Some of the comments are kind of lengthy, but I encourage you to, if you want to say it or speak it, please do.
Just this comment about the elders just made me think about, like this, the need for elders that I think, many folks in our generation, myself being like a millennial, I guess, really speak to. And then, even just on the news, I heard the other day that the Standing Rock nations are prioritizing folks who speak, their elders who speak Dakota and Lakota language, because they are recognizing that if they lose the language, it will be an irreparable loss if they lose the language and the people who speak the language, which, feels very foreign to me as somebody who, doesn't really prioritize English as like a cultural thing.
Wow, that's very powerful. That's very powerful. Okay, so the question is, okay, are there models of collecting healing that you are using that you could share? I don't necessarily know if I have a model. I don't know if I necessarily, have a model per se. Is more, I feel like for me, it's more of a method, which is to connect and, use any means necessary to connect with other people. And for me, it's not just about being with people in the same space at the same time, but it's also choosing how I show up in that space and modeling that for other people, which in turn makes it safe for them to show up in a certain kind of way. And so whether the interaction is 1 minute or whether it's 5 minutes or it's an hour, that they leave, that we both leave that interaction having had an experience of connection that gives us, enough of what we need to, make it just sometimes even to the next day. And I think that sometimes we make it this when it really boils down to the simplicity of human connection, which is saying hello. So much of that has been lost because of COVID, but I actually think people have gotten a little bit ruder and more unkind in some way, in a lot of ways. But I think that, the model is maximizing every opportunity to connect. And when those opportunities for connection present themselves, being authentic and as present as possible. And so what that requires is that before I go out to engage with other people, I have to spend some time being present with me. I have to spend some time being present with me. I have to spend some time being present in my place of spirituality and faith. Okay. And then I have to be intentional about reaching out to the people that come into my heart in those moments of being still and connecting with them, trusting that in that moment, there is something that needs to be connected and responded to. And what I have found is that has literally, it's changed everything for me. it's changed everything. It's changed everything for me. And I'll give you a very personal example. I'll probably start crying. But recently my uncle died. And about 2 weeks before he died, it was New Year's Eve, and I was driving, and I just felt this. I felt like my aunt in my heart, and I called her, and I just said, "Auntie, I just want you to know that I love you. I'm thinking of you. I appreciate you, and I value you." And she said, "Thank you so much. It's so good to hear from you." So she's my aunt. We have a love connection. We have a spirit connection, but we don't talk a lot, right? We don't have that woman, like we don't talk a lot, but we have a connection. But in that moment, I hadn't talked to her in a while, but in that moment of being in my place of being present with myself spiritually, I felt that I needed to, on New Year's Eve, let her know that she was loved and that she was valued. And then I prayed for her and with her. And it was such a precious conversation. And it was no more than 10 minutes. It wasn't even that. And then a couple weeks later, my uncle died. And I was so, so very grateful that I had not ignored that nudging in my heart to connect my heart with hers. Now, I still would have connected with her, especially with my uncle dying. I would have connected with her, and it would have been received, and I would have been comfortable in making that connection. But do you see how much more seamless it was? And how she felt that conversation beforehand, those weeks beforehand, less than 10 minutes. It came from being present. And I've had connections like that on the street, walking down the street. So when you talk about model, for me, it's literally tearing down these walls of isolation, one person at a time, one heart at a time, one story at a time, one sound at a time, one tear at a time, one touch at a time, one conversation at a time. And I think that in order to do that, we have to acknowledge that we're hurting. We have to forgive the people in our social network who didn't show up like we thought they would. We have to let them go so that we can make space to receive the people that God wants to put in our path to offer us those compassionate words, those acts of kindness, those acts of presence, that we can have capacity to receive that. And since I've learned to do that, even in conflict, even in conflict, that's a form of being present, right? Even in conflict, since I've learned to do that, it's helped me with that sense of isolation, that when I go out the house, I'm not going out thinking, oh my God, I hope I don't see anybody. I'm going out anticipating that I might see someone. And if I do, is there an opportunity for interaction that could change their life, that can convey value, love, hope, connection? And so for me, that's the model.
One thing that somebody had brought up previously in the chat, just about kind of grief taking your ability to kind of deal with daily details and feeling overwhelmed. It's not so much a question, but I'm kind of curious people's thoughts. But they said, I think of grief fog as being created by our minds and emotions being so overwhelmed dealing with the realities and surreal aspects of a loss that there's no energy left over to deal with the usual daily details. In some ways, I wish we could bring back the symbols of being in mourning, the black bunting on a house, black clothing and such, that are and were used in many cultures to alert others that the person is distracted by loss. And I just thought that this was like a really interesting thought.
Yes. One of the first things that, for a lot of people don't realize is that that whole ability to have attention to details, which is why it doesn't make sense for bereavement employers to have bereavement time for 3 days. And it can only be for immediate family members. When so many of us have created surrogate families, our friends are our family members. So, you know, like I remember when my best friend died and feeling this pressure to go, you know, still have to show up and perform, because after all, it's kind of like, well, you know, who wants to hear that your best friend died and that's why you can't come to work? But it's my best friend. And going back to this idea that another person does not get to determine the quality and the value of that relationship and connection that you had with that person. And so to that point, when I'm aware of that, and when you're aware of that, when you get that brain fog, which is part of your stress response, it's a natural part of your stress response. But when you get that brain fog, and people are saying, well, what can I do to help? What can I do to help? You know, saying, you know what, well, I need you to do this and this and this and this. But taking your time and sometimes just knowing that you're going to forget things, that it's going to be hard to concentrate. That's enough in and of itself. When I go meet with people after they have experienced some kind of traumatic loss or they've experienced loss, the first thing I do is ask them about their body. That's the first thing I do, is ask them about their health, because a broken heart is real. That's the first thing I do. Are you on any medications? Okay, right. The next thing I do, the next thing I do is like, well, how are you doing? They're like, well, I was driving here and then I forgot where I was going and I ended up here, and I'm like, you're not crazy. They'll say, I think I'm going crazy. No, you're not crazy. I've been calling this number my whole life and all of a sudden I can't remember this phone number. You're not crazy. And going into anniversary dates, going into key seasons and times of the year or important dates or events can trigger that same stress response and that same emotional and mental fog the same way it did when the loss first happened. And that doesn't matter. It could be 1 year or 20 years. Your body will go into shutdown. And I want to say this, there's no time limit on grief. Right? It's a journey, and it is a lifelong journey of learning how to live. But in the context that we're in, we're trying to learn this on multiple levels with so many losses.
We have about 5 minutes left for discussion. Are there any other thoughts or comments people would like to bring up?
I don't. Yeah, I know this was a lot, and I've tried to share some of my heart with you, just in terms of if you want a more academic thing, I could schedule something. We could do something like more academic, but I just wanted to give you just a little bit of insight to, this idea around how our social circles are being impacted, and to think how we create capacity individually and collectively to deal with loss. Brenda has her hand up.
Yeah, I just want to thank you, Lisa. This was great. And I wanted to ask you more about that, about any reflections you have, especially in this traumatic time, on how we can build resiliency collectively from the grassroots up.
Well, I saw someone put in the chat about creative arts, and I think the use of arts is, you know, to help people tap into some of these other ways that they can be present and give expression to what they are experiencing. I think that's a way to tap in, you know, to resiliency. Another way to tap into resiliency is to, I think that we don't always pay attention to what we do well, And I think that a lot of us we get trapped into, you know, just like a one trick pony. This is what we go to Brenda for. This is what we go to Melissa for. Okay, this is what we go to Lisa for. This is what we go to Luz for, right? We get tracked, and I think that sometimes we become one-dimensional in how we view ourselves and how we view other people. And because of that, we don't always see ourselves in full dimension and what we have already at hand that is bolstering or can bolster our resilience. Another thing in terms of building resilience is, and I had actually wrote this down earlier, was that, you know, building resilience means that I said this earlier, but I'll say it again. You can't go to a round hole with a square peg. You know, like at some point in time, you're going to have to take a risk and come out of your comfort zone and go take the square peg and take it into a square hole, instead of trying to force something, which then takes up more energy and time. Certainly movement fosters resilience. Being more aware of your body helps to foster resilience. I think that having hard conversations around things that you have been avoiding in your life that now you can no longer avoid, and kind of having those conversations has a way of almost decluttering your spirit, decluttering your mind, decluttering your heart, and even decluttering your relationship circles, is a way that we can foster resilience as well, because we're creating capacity to actually think about our strengths, think about the strengths of other people, accurately match them versus based on capacity and not expectation, which is not always realistic. And I think that once we start to be intentional about some of that, then that can foster some of the individual resiliency. And as we foster that individual resiliency, we can start to build that out into the community. And certainly, you know, the sanctuary, people's health clinic, all of this work is about fostering resiliency, because you guys are all about creating community and space. And you've helped me be resilient, right? You know what I'm saying? You all have helped me to be resilient. And having that community to tap into, you know, when I get a text from Melissa, just acknowledging, Shanita Thomas's death, right? That fostered resilience in me to have more capacity to be, hold space for someone else later on that you need to have a conversation about the death of, Miss Thomas. And so again, we take these examples and then we build them out, and then we create intention. Because right now, I think that we're just kind of rolling into one crisis after another, and everybody is in this crisis alarm state when things happen, and there's no strategy and no plan. And when we do strategize and plan, it's from that, I'm gonna call it that crisis brain, as opposed to planning from a place of calm and being proactive and saying, you know what, we know racialized trauma is not going to stop happening. We know racialized losses are not going to stop happening. We know deaths due to COVID is not going to stop happening. We know that deaths due to violence are not going to stop happening. So while we have a window and an opportunity, the people who are least affected can we come together and support those who are most affected, and so that we can start to strategize about what does collective capacity building look like in a way that can that fosters resilience at the community level.
Whew. Wow, thank you so much, Lisa. Are there any last comments, or Lisa, is there anything you would like to kind of end with?
No, I don't know. I think yeah, no, I'm my heart is full right now. Like my heart is full because that whole concept of stretch is just so personal to me. So the things that I shared, you know, I was trying to share my PowerPoint, that didn't work out, but you know, I wanted to share it from my lens and some of my experience, and let people know that they're not alone with feeling stretched and overcapacity. You are not alone. That you are loved, that you are valued, that there are people that care. And my prayer is that you will experience the love and the care that you need from every source that is available and every source that's willing to be available, so that you know that you're going to make it. We're going to make it. And we're here to hold each other, whether it's in word, prayer, spirit, heart, or deed. So that.
Wow. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for joining on this Friday night, our new Friday nights in the pandemic on the computer. And I in that line of, you know, that we will kind of emerge, I just want to make a couple announcements about certain events that the People's Health Sanctuary are hosting. And one of them is the Emerging Out of Darkness, the Altar for Our Beloved Dead, which I'm going to post the link in here, which initially was started right around the time of the solstice, but that we've decided to keep going until hopefully maybe even April. And Nancy or Brenda, I don't know if you want to speak anything about it.
I just have to say thank you for your heartfelt and such life-affirming presentation, Lisa. Really, it's really touched me. And also, there were so many wonderful segues to giving this little blurb about the memorial altar. When you talked about the healing capacity building that can come from creative efforts and from the community building, and also the efforts of telling people stories, saying their names. So at Freedom Square, until hopefully the spring, there is a wonderful co-created memorial altar to the ancestors. And we welcome you to come by, leave offerings, write people's names. It's covered under a fair amount of snow right now, but life, like grief, when the snow melts, some more emerges, and then it changes as people contribute things. So we welcome you to stop by and commune with the earth and the ancestors and those who you've lost.
Great, thank you. And in the chat, I just put the link to the event, as well as we're looking for people to help us kind of keep the space clean, take some snow off. There's also people who have donated amazing cookies and food, books. If you'd like to help out, just email the info@mediasanctuary.org to come help out. As well, we're going to have the third event of the End of Life series, Dying with Dignity, with Corinne Carey Shaken on March 19th at 6:30 as well. And I'm just posting the event here in the chat as well. Lastly, just some updates about the People's Health Sanctuary. As I said in the beginning, hopefully we're going to be located in the new nature lab, or we will be located in the new nature lab when it opens up, and hopefully the People's Health Sanctuary space will open up sometime in the late spring, early summer, with all things pending. So there's gonna be a lot of work around that. We're working to create an advisory council for the People's Health Sanctuary with representatives from different organizations, and there'll be a lot of social media and fundraising campaign updates coming out soon. So please be aware of them, and find any way to help us create a space for health justice and autonomous health in North Central Troy. And just something that is in the works right now that we're, if you're interested at all, helping us out with, but there's going to be a merger between St. Peter's Health System, which covers Samaritan, St. Peter's, St. Mary's, and Memorial, and Ellis Hospital in Schenectady. There's been interest in creating some type of community conversation about what that will look like, specifically because St. Peter's is a Catholic-based organization and they have limited access to reproductive care, and so what that will look like for the folks of Schenectady. Are there any other announcements that anyone would like to make? And lastly, I'm just going to put in here, if you'd like to sign up for more information about the People's Health Sanctuary, you can sign up here, and we'll get you some emails, as well as thank you so much to the Sanctuary for all their ongoing support and always being a place of community and a place that we can find resilience. And as all organizations are now, the Sanctuary is desperately looking for people to help support financially. So I'm going to put in the chat, if you're able to help support and in these times, please think of the Sanctuary. And with that, I want to close us off tonight. Thank you so much, Lisa, and for your words, your heartfelt words. Again, sorry for your loss, among the many losses that everyone you've mentioned has suffered. And thank you for adding a little bit of resiliency, I think, to all of us. I feel that as well after your words. So thank you all so much for joining us. Please look up Urban Grief and the great work that Lisa and Charisma among the rest of their staff are doing. It's quite amazing.
Thank you.
All right. Good night, y'all. Take care.
Good night.
In this life, we continue to seek answers from the lying leaders. In this life, we live for food and food alone. Now see now, I am so tired of witnessing children that are filled with need. I am so tired of living in a world saturated with greed. And see my spirit cries out against the injustices committed upon my peoples. I am so tired of the illusions upon this earth. The true history is kept from my children, and in this life, illusion reigns. And in this life, we continue to seek answers from the lying leaders. Yes, in this life, we live for food and food alone. See, Lord, my people die, people cry, people try to survive on this planet full of mysteries. My people die, people cry, people try to survive on this planet full. Oh Lord, my people die, people cry, people try to survive on this planet full of mysteries. My people die, people cry, people try to survive on this planet full. And so we run as they pull out the gun. They're shooting to kill our cultures. We are so tired of the illusions upon this earth. And see, Lord, our spirits cry out against the injustices committed upon the peoples. We are so and lying leaders in this world. We live for food and food alone. Come down, job the children. Come down and lead us through. Rise up, spirit of the people. Rise up and lead us through. I say, come down, job the children. Come down and lead us through. Rise up, spirit of the people. Rise up and lead us. Oh Lord, my people die, people cry, people try to survive on this planet full of mysteries. My people die, people cry, people try to survive on this planet full. Yeah, my people die, people cry, people try to survive on this planet full of mysteries. My people die, people